The world did not end with a bang. For Petty Officer First Class Elena Vasquez, it ended with a silence so complete, so absolute, that for a moment she believed she had died. 1 second she was crouched behind a crumbling stone wall in a village north of Kandahar, radio pressed against her cheek, whispering coordinates to a SEAL commander bleeding out 30 meters away. The next second, the sky turned white. The IED detonated so close, she felt the heat peel across her face before the sound could reach her. And then the sound never came. Not the screams of her team. Not the crack of incoming rifle fire. Not her own voice when she tried to call out his name. Nothing. Just a high, ringing nothing that swallowed the entire battlefield. Blood ran from both her ears, and through the dust she saw Commander Hayes clutching his thigh, mouth moving, eyes locked on hers, begging her for something she could no longer hear. She had exactly 4 minutes before he bled out. She could not speak. She could not hear. She could only move her hands. And in that moment, she understood something the Navy had never taught her in any manual. Would you have frozen, or would you have fought? Tell me honestly in the comments, because what she did next changed everything. Elena Vasquez was not born into a military family, and for most of her childhood, she had no intention of ever wearing a uniform. She grew up in a small, sun-bleached town in the southern stretch of Arizona, the kind of place where the highway bent around a single gas station and the nearest hospital was 40 miles away. Her mother cleaned rooms at a roadside motel, and her father had disappeared before Elena was old enough to remember the shape of his face. What she remembered instead was her grandmother, a quiet woman who had lost her hearing to a childhood fever and who taught Elena American Sign Language before Elena could even spell her own name. In that small house, conversations happened in the air, in the curl of a finger, in the sharp snap of a palm, in the gentle press of a thumb against a chin. Elena learned to read faces the way other children learned to read books. She learned that silence was not emptiness. Silence was a language, and that language would one day save a man's life. She enlisted in the Navy at 19, not out of patriotism exactly, but out of hunger. She wanted out of the desert. She wanted college paid for. She wanted, more than anything, to become someone her grandmother could point to with pride. She scored high enough on her entrance exams to be offered a slot in the Navy's cryptologic technician pipeline, a field she barely understood when she signed the paperwork. Within a year, she was sitting in a classroom in Pensacola, learning the architecture of enemy radio networks, the rhythm of encrypted chatter, the way a single mispronounced word in Pashto could identify a high-value target. Her instructors noted something unusual about her almost immediately. She processed audio information differently than the other recruits. Where they heard noise, she heard patterns. Where they heard interference, she heard intent. An old chief pulled her aside after a training exercise and told her, in the blunt way chiefs speak, that she had the best ear he had seen in 20 years of teaching. She did not tell him about her grandmother. She did not tell him that she had spent her entire childhood learning to extract meaning from the smallest movements, the faintest signals, the things other people ignored. She simply nodded, thanked him, and went back to work. By the time she was 23, she had deployed twice, earned the respect of men twice her age, and been selected for a specialized linguistic support team attached to a Naval Special Warfare Task Unit. She did not know it yet, but she was about to meet a man named Commander Daniel Hayes, and her entire definition of duty was about to change. Commander Hayes was not the kind of officer who walked into a room and demanded attention. He was the kind who sat quietly at the back of the briefing, arms folded, listening while everyone else talked. Elena noticed him the first time she attached to his unit because he was the only man in the tent who did not look at her the way men usually looked at a young female sailor in a combat zone. He looked at her the way her grandmother used to look at her, with a steady, measuring patience, as if he were trying to understand what she actually was rather than what she appeared to be. During her first mission briefing with his team, she corrected a translator's interpretation of an intercepted call. The translator, a contractor twice her age, bristled and insisted she was wrong. Hayes asked her to explain. She told him, calmly, that the speaker had used a regional idiom that meant the opposite of what the translator had rendered, and that if the team acted on the wrong interpretation, they would be walking into a prepared ambush rather than an empty compound. Hayes stared at her for a long moment. Then he canceled the operation and ordered a fresh reconnaissance flyover. 12 hours later, satellite imagery confirmed exactly what Elena had said. From that day forward, Hayes requested her on every sensitive mission his unit ran. He never said why. He never praised her in front of others. But she noticed that when she spoke, he stopped whatever he was doing and listened. And in a world where women in her role were often talked over, interrupted, or dismissed, that single act of silent respect meant more than any commendation. She also noticed that Hayes carried the weight of command like a man who had buried too many friends. She learned, from scraps of conversation and the quiet gossip of his chiefs, that he had lost 3 operators in a single compound raid the year before, and that he blamed himself for every one of them. He worked harder than any man she had ever seen. He slept less. He wrote letters to widows by hand. He memorized the names of their children. He never missed a memorial. Elena began to understand something important about leadership during those months. Real leadership was not the voice that shouted loudest in the command tent. Real leadership was the man who walked the perimeter at 3 in the morning to check on the youngest sailor pulling guard duty. Real leadership was the officer who took the blame when things went wrong and gave the credit away when things went right. Real leadership, she realized, looked a great deal like the quiet discipline her grandmother had shown every day of her life, refusing to be pitted, refusing to be reduced, refusing to let the world decide what she could and could not do. Elena began to model herself on both of them, the deaf old woman in Arizona and the silent commander in Afghanistan, and she did not yet know that the 2 of them were preparing her, without knowing each other, for the single worst day of her life. The mission that changed everything was supposed to be routine. A local informant, cultivated over 18 months of patient work, had agreed to meet the team in a village north of Kandahar to hand over a drive containing the names and movement patterns of a bomb-making network responsible for the deaths of at least 40 coalition personnel. Elena was attached to the operation as the linguistic and signal specialist. Her job was to listen to the radio chatter on captured frequencies during the meeting and provide real-time warning if enemy forces were converging on the location. It was the kind of mission the unit had run dozens of times. Hayes briefed it himself, walked through every contingency, and reminded the team, as he always did, that no piece of intelligence was worth a single American life. They rolled out before dawn in 3 vehicles, crossed 2 dry riverbeds, and arrived at the village as the first light touched the mountains. The meeting itself lasted less than 6 minutes. The informant was nervous, sweating through his shirt, his eyes flicking constantly toward the alley behind him. Elena, listening through her headset, heard something on the local frequency that did not belong. A single word, repeated 3 times in a coded children's rhyme she had studied in Pensacola years earlier. It was the signal for a coordinated attack. She keyed her radio and said one word. Compromised. Hayes moved instantly. He ordered the team to fall back to the vehicles, positioned himself at the rear of the withdrawal, and waved Elena ahead of him toward the lead truck. That was when the first IED detonated under the middle vehicle, flipping it onto its side. Small arms fire erupted from 2 rooftops. The informant vanished into a doorway and was never seen again. Hayes took a round through the outer thigh as he pulled a wounded corpseman behind a low wall. Elena, sprinting toward him with her radio still keyed, saw him go down. She did not stop. She reached him, dragged him the final 4 meters behind the wall, and began packing the wound with a hemostatic bandage while calling in their position to the quick reaction force. Then the second IED went off. It had been buried under the wall itself, a backup charge meant to kill any survivors who took cover there. The blast lifted Elena into the air and slammed her down 3 meters away. When she opened her eyes, the world was moving but making no sound. She saw dust. She saw Hayes, alive, bleeding, pressing his hand against his thigh. She saw her own blood on the stones beneath her. She touched her ears, and her fingers came away red. She tried to speak and felt her throat vibrate, but the sound never reached her own mind. The ringing was not ringing. The ringing was nothing. And Hayes was losing blood faster than his tourniquet could hold, and the quick reaction force was still 11 minutes out, and she was the only trained medic within reach. And she could not hear a single word he was trying to tell her. There are moments in a soldier's life when training is no longer enough, when every drill, every repetition, every classroom hour collapses into a single instant of decision. For Elena, That moment arrived behind a crumbling stone wall with the commander bleeding into the dust and her own hearing gone, perhaps forever. Her first instinct was panic, a bright metallic taste at the back of her throat, a cold flood in her chest. She let it come. She let it pass. And then, without consciously deciding to, she raised her hands and began to sign. Not military hand signals, which were designed for silent tactical movement and did not include the vocabulary of trauma medicine. American Sign Language, the language of her grandmother, the language she had spoken before she spoke English. She signed to Hayes the only question that mattered. Where? Where is the pain? Where is the bleeding worst? Hayes, to her astonishment, understood. Not the specific signs, because he did not know ASL, but the intent behind them. He pointed to his thigh. She signed again, pressing her hand flat against her own leg to mirror his wound, then opening and closing her fist in a universal gesture for pumping blood. He nodded. She understood. The femoral artery was compromised. She had perhaps 3 minutes before he went into irreversible hypovolemic shock. She pulled a second tourniquet from her medical pouch, cinched it high on his thigh above the first, and twisted the windlass until the bleeding slowed to a weep. Then she placed her hand on his chest, over his heart, and held it there. She could not hear his breathing, but she could feel it. She counted the rise and fall against her palm. She watched his pupils. She watched the color of his lips. She did everything a medic is trained to do, except she did it in a world without sound, guided only by touch and sight and the muscle memory of 1,000 hours of training. Then came the second problem. The quick reaction force was inbound, but they needed guidance. The team's radios were scattered across the kill zone. Elena could not speak into a handset and be understood if she could not hear the response. She looked at Hayes and made a decision that would later be studied at the Naval Special Warfare Center as an example of battlefield adaptation under impossible conditions. She took his hand, placed it flat against her own palm, and began tapping out Morse code with her index finger against his skin. ... The message was short. 2 tangos north roof. 1 south alley. QRF approach east. Hayes, a man who had learned Morse in his first year as an officer and never forgotten it, felt every letter. He keyed his own radio, which was still clipped to his vest, and relayed her intelligence word for word. 2 minutes later, the rooftop shooters were eliminated by a pair of incoming Apaches. 4 minutes later, the quick reaction force rolled through the eastern approach exactly as Elena had indicated. Hayes lived. The corpsman lived. Every American on that ground walked or was carried out alive. And Elena, lying on a stretcher in the back of a medevac helicopter, still could not hear a single sound of the world she had just saved. The weeks that followed were harder than the battlefield. Elena was flown first to Landstuhl and then to Walter Reed, and the doctors told her in careful, measured sentences what she already suspected. The blast had ruptured both eardrums and damaged the delicate cochlear structures in her inner ears. Some hearing might return. Much of it would not. She would almost certainly never again qualify for the job she loved, the job she had trained for, the job that had given her life its shape and meaning. She sat on the edge of a hospital bed and read those words on a notepad and did not cry. She had learned, from the old woman in Arizona, that tears were a private matter and grief was a discipline like any other. She nodded. She thanked the doctor. She asked for a pen and wrote a single sentence in reply. When can I start rehabilitation? The harder fight was not physical. It was the quiet war against the assumption that she was finished. Well-meaning officers suggested medical retirement. Well-meaning friends suggested she had already given enough. A review board convened to discuss her future in the Navy, and she walked into that room with her grandmother's posture and her commander's patience, and she made her case in writing, 1 page. No wasted words. She argued that her skills as a cryptologic technician and linguist had never depended primarily on hearing. She argued that modern assistive technology, combined with her native fluency in ASL and her trained ability to read lips in 3 languages, made her more capable, not less, in signal analysis roles. She argued, finally, that the Navy had invested 7 years in her training and that to discard her now would be a waste of taxpayer resources and institutional memory. The board deliberated for 2 days. Then they reassigned her to a stateside intelligence unit with full accommodations and full rank. Commander Hayes visited her during her recovery. He walked into her hospital room on a gray afternoon in March, still limping from the wound she had packed, and he did something she had never seen him do before. He signed to her, clumsily, with the thick fingers of a man who had learned the alphabet from a printed chart the night before, but he signed to her. "Thank you." She signed back, "You are welcome." He sat down in the chair beside her bed, and they talked for 2 hours, half in sign, half in written notes, half in the silent understanding that passes between people who have survived something together. Before he left, he told her that he had recommended her for the Silver Star, not for the medicine she had practiced under fire, but for the intelligence she had transmitted through a human hand when every other channel had failed. He told her that in 22 years of service he had never seen anything like it. He told her that she had taught him something he had not known he needed to learn, which was that silence, properly used, is not the absence of command. Silence is command in its purest form. Elena Vasquez received the Silver Star in a small ceremony at the Washington Navy Yard 11 months after the explosion. Her grandmother, now 81 and frail but still sharp-eyed, flew in from Arizona for the first time in her life and watched from the front row as the citation was read aloud and then, at Elena's quiet request, signed in ASL by a Navy interpreter so that the old woman could understand every word. When the Admiral pinned the medal on Elena's chest, the room applauded, and Elena could hear some of it now, faint and muffled through the hearing aids that had given her back perhaps 40% of what she had lost. But it was her grandmother's face she watched, not the Admiral's, and it was her grandmother's hands she saw moving in the front row, signing a single phrase over and over. "I am proud. I am proud. I am proud." She did not leave the Navy. She could have. Many expected her to. Instead, she transferred into a training role at the Center for Information Warfare, where she taught young cryptologic technicians how to extract meaning from incomplete signals, how to operate when primary communication channels failed, and how to think in languages other than sound. Her course became mandatory within 18 months. Her students, many of them women who had never seen a senior female instructor in their specialty, began requesting her unit by name. She developed a protocol, now used across multiple branches, for tactical communication in environments where radio silence or sensory loss compromises standard procedure. The protocol is built on a simple foundation. It uses the hand, the eye, and the trained human capacity to improvise under pressure. It is taught alongside Morse code and standard tactical signals. Instructors refer to it, informally, as the Vasquez method. She stayed in touch with Commander Hayes for the rest of his career. He retired 4 years later as a captain, and at his retirement ceremony, he asked her to stand beside him on the stage, and when he spoke about the people who had shaped his life as an officer, he named her first. He said that on the worst day of his life, when he was bleeding out behind a wall in a country far from home, a young woman who could no longer hear the world had reached across the silence and pulled him back into it. He said that every officer eventually learns that command is not about the orders you give. Command is about the people who choose to save you when they do not have to. He said her name, and he said it clearly, and then he saluted her, and she returned the salute, and the room stood. Elena Vasquez's story is not a story about hearing loss. It is not even, in the end, a story about a battlefield in Afghanistan. It is a story about what happens when a human being refuses to accept the limits the world has decided to place on her. She grew up in a silent house and learned that silence could carry love. She joined a Navy that did not always know what to do with a young woman from a small desert town, and she made herself indispensable through patience, precision, and the quiet discipline of showing up every single day and doing the work. She survived an explosion that should have killed her, and in the 4 minutes that followed, she saved a commander's life using a language her grandmother had taught her before she could read. She lost most of her hearing, and she refused to lose anything else. She stayed in uniform. She taught others. She turned her wound into a doctrine, and her doctrine into a legacy. What her story teaches is simple, and it is the oldest lesson the military has ever known, though each generation must learn it again. Leadership is not loudness. Courage is not the absence of fear. Strength is not the body you were given, but the spirit you refuse to surrender. Every obstacle, properly faced, becomes a skill. Every silence, properly used, becomes a voice. Elena did not save Commander Hayes because she was the bravest person in that village. She saved him because she had spent her entire life listening to a world that was not always ready to listen back. And when the moment came, she knew exactly what to do with her hands. Somewhere in a classroom tonight, a young sailor is learning her method. Somewhere in a hospital, a veteran is being told she can still serve. And somewhere, in the quiet space between one heartbeat and the next, the lesson continues. You are never finished. You are only beginning. Carry her story forward.